May 1947. A weak, aging man steps slowly out of a car onto a foggy California hilltop. The wind cuts through the silence. No music, no laughter, no champagne glasses clinking by the pool. This is Hearst Castle, once the loudest symbol of wealth and power in America, now eerily quiet. For nearly 3 decades, this mountain palace was the most outrageous playground the country had ever seen. Hollywood royalty swam beneath Roman columns. Politicians whispered deals under gold-leaf ceilings. Millionaires wandered past ancient marble statues, while zebras grazed casually on the lawn. It was excess without limits. But tonight, the dream is over. The man standing here is William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful newspaper tycoon in American history. He built this castle as a monument to success, control, and fantasy. Now he can barely afford to keep the lights on. The palace that once roared with life has become a silent cage, one he cannot escape. Behind every glittering party was a secret Hearst never wanted the world to see. Why did the richest media mogul in America pour an unimaginable fortune into a mountain retreat he would ultimately abandon? How did a childhood dream of castles turn into a stone obsession that slowly drained his empire? This is not just the story of a beautiful mansion. It's a story of ambition unchecked, of money spent without fear, and of a dream that grew too large to survive. So what happens when your dream house starts consuming your life? To understand the fall, we must first return to the rise. In the early 1930s, Hearst Castle, known then as La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill, was the most famous private home in America. Guests arrived by private train, then climbed the mountain roads in long lines of black limousines. What awaited them felt unreal. A Spanish Renaissance palace stood against the sky, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The Neptune pool stretched over 100 feet, wrapped in Vermont marble and guarded by a Roman temple shipped piece by piece from Europe. Inside, the Roman pool shimmered in blue and gold mosaics beneath vaulted ceilings. Scattered across the hills were guest houses larger than most people's homes. This wasn't just a house, it was a stage, and Hearst was directing the grandest performance of his life. But every performance ends.
And soon, the castle would go quiet. Zebras grazed lazily on carefully manicured grasslands, their stripes shimmering in the California sun. William Randolph Hearst wandered the grounds in a rumpled sweater, inspecting new statues, sprawling gardens, and wings still under construction. Friday nights at Hearst Castle were legendary. Guests gathered in the Grand Assembly Room, where movie stars sat beside senators and studio directors pitched ideas to Hollywood's most influential producers. At the center of it all, Hearst presided over the long refectory table, Marian Davies by his side, steering conversation, smoothing tensions, and keeping every guest at ease. Dinner was only the beginning. Afterward, the private theater lit up with film screenings, followed by dancing beneath crystal chandeliers, a game of billiards, or leisurely strolls through moonlit gardens. The rules were simple, yet strictly enforced. Dress for dinner, lights out by midnight, no business talk at the table, and, most importantly, never ever criticize Hearst or his newspapers in print. Most guests obeyed. To defy the man who owned more newspapers than anyone else in America was unthinkable. The castle was too beautiful, access too exclusive, and the experience too rare to risk losing. This was the American dream carved in stone and marble. It was proof that a boy from San Francisco could build a palace grander than European nobility, more private than any gentleman's club, and more talked about than the White House itself. Yet by May 1947, that dream was crumbling. Floodlights stayed dark. Guest cottages sat empty. Rusting construction equipment littered unfinished terraces. Hearst himself was living in exile in Beverly Hills, his health deteriorating, his fortune drained by decades of spending faster than even a media empire could replenish. The castle he had built to proclaim his power had become the ultimate symbol of his decline. What happened between the wild parties in these silent halls? How does a man spend nearly 30 years constructing a palace only to lose it before his death? The answer is woven from yellow journalism, broken marriages, loyal architects, a devoted mistress, and one simple truth: some dreams are too big to complete and too costly to abandon. This is the story of that dream, how William Randolph Hearst transformed a barren California hillside into the most extravagant private estate in American history, filling it with art sourced from European estates and guests borrowed from Hollywood's A-list. How he wielded it as a stage for power, a refuge from scandal, and a monument to appetites that could never quite be satisfied. It is also the story of the people who built it for him, lived within its walls, and watched it slip from his grasp when fortune finally ran dry. The castle still stands, but Hearst is gone, and the parties he once threw echo only as whispers in marble corridors. Chapter 2: The Boy Who Grew Up in Someone Else's Mansion. Hearst's obsession with grandeur began early. Born in 1863 in San Francisco, William Randolph Hearst was the son of George Hearst, a rugged mining millionaire who struck gold in Nevada and silver in South Dakota, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a schoolteacher from Missouri who married into wealth yet never forgot her humble beginnings. The boy who grew up surrounded by luxury and ambition would one day turn a dream into stone, a dream that would dazzle the world and ultimately consume the man who built it. The family had money, but refinement was another matter.
In the eyes of San Francisco's old money society, George Hearst's fortune from gold and silver mines could buy almost anything, but it could not buy elegance. George was a practical man, skilled in veins and mining claims, but indifferent to art, etiquette, or appearances. Phoebe Apperson Hearst was different. She craved culture, respectability, and sophistication. Most of all, she wanted her son, William, to grow up as a true gentleman, not as a miner's child with rough hands and coarsely spoken words. So she filled their San Francisco mansion with rules. Dinner required proper dress. Classical music lessons echoed through the hallways. French tutors drilled grammar and manners. Art books imported from Europe lined the shelves. Young Willie grew up surrounded by wealth, yet starved for warmth. His father was often away at the mines or in Washington, serving as a United States senator. His mother was present, but exacting, demanding perfection, constantly steering him toward an ideal he could never quite reach. The house felt hers, not his. Even the art, the Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, Persian rugs, seemed like her argument to the world that the Hearsts belonged among San Francisco's oldest, most respected families, those who regarded mining fortunes as vulgar and new. Willie quickly learned a hard truth. He was always being measured, never quite refined, never quite sophisticated, never quite enough. He had everything, yet it never truly felt like his own. Then came the trip that changed everything. In 1873, when Willie was 10, Phoebe took him on an 18-month tour of Europe. They wandered the museums of Paris, the galleries of Florence, and the grand castles along the Rhine. Phoebe studied art and architecture with the rigor of a scholar. Willie absorbed something different. He saw power made tangible, visible in stone, marble, and gold. European nobility lived in castles, their halls filled with treasures amassed over centuries. Walking through those rooms was to walk through proof of significance, proof that your family mattered enough to leave a permanent mark on the world. Willie wanted that. Not a title, which America lacked, but the physical manifestation of legacy. A palace, a collection, an empire expressed in architecture and art. The seed was planted. Decades later, it would grow into something monumental. Even then, the boy who felt small in his mother's house was already dreaming of a palace he could truly call his own. Back in San Francisco, school offered no solace. Bright but unfocused, charming yet rebellious, Willie constantly tested his mother's strictures. Phoebe sent him east to Harvard, hoping the Ivy League would polish away his rough edges. It did not. Willie was expelled after orchestrating a costly, elaborate prank, sending chamber pots engraved with the professors' names to the faculty, a mischievous testament to his brilliance, his audacity, and his refusal to be tamed. It was classic Hearst excess in service of juvenile rebellion. But the expulsion from Harvard mattered little. By then, George Hearst had acquired a struggling newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, largely to bolster his political ambitions. At 23, William Randolph Hearst convinced his father to let him run it. Young, wealthy, reckless, and hungry to prove himself in ways his mother would never approve, he saw newspapers as the perfect weapon for a boy who had grown up feeling powerless in his own home.
Newspapers allowed you to shape reality. They let you tell people what to think, attack enemies where they could not fight back, and create something loud, public, and undeniably yours. And if wielded skillfully, newspapers could make enough money to build castles. Chapter 3. Building an Empire with Headlines and Fear. When Hearst took control of the Examiner in 1887, it was on life support. Circulation was dwindling, advertising was sparse, and readers had better options. His father expected the paper to fail quietly. Hearst had other plans. He studied Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, America's most successful newspaper, and drew a simple, ruthless lesson. Facts alone are boring. Readers craved drama, heroes, villains, and emotion. News should provoke, ignite, and enthrall. Hearst applied that lesson and pushed it further than anyone else. He hired the best writers, paying more than any competing paper. He purchased state-of-the-art printing presses and ran enormous illustrations across the front page. Murders, disasters, and society scandals leapt off the paper in vivid detail. Headlines and letters were printed so large they could be read across the street. He instructed his reporters to chase stories that angered, terrified, or amazed readers. Crime was magnified, social scandals investigated with surgical intensity, political corruption exposed with righteous fury. If a story lacked drama, Hearst's editors knew how to sharpen it. A fire became a catastrophe, a quarrel turned into a feud, a minor accident was retold as a narrowly averted tragedy. The city devoured every sensational word. It worked. Circulation skyrocketed. Advertisers followed. Within a few years, the Examiner was not just profitable, it was dominant. Hearst had done what his father never could. He had mastered a business built on influence, spectacle, and fear. He had turned a failing newspaper into a weapon of power, a public stage for his ambitions, and the first brick in a career that would eventually fund palaces, parties, and the most audacious private empire in American history. San Francisco, however, was too small for the ambitions swelling inside William Randolph Hearst. In 1895, he bought the New York Morning Journal and brought his sensational formula east. New York, the biggest stage in American journalism, would be his proving ground, and he arrived ready for war. His chief rival, Joseph Pulitzer, already entrenched in a golden tower in Lower Manhattan, ruling the city's news with a mix of cunning and flair. What followed was a circulation battle that reshaped American media. Hearst outbid Pulitzer for star writers and cartoonists. He slashed his paper's price to 1 penny, selling at a loss just to steal readers. Sunday editions exploded with color printing and comic strips that became national obsessions. His paper screamed louder, printed larger images, and told wilder, more sensational stories than anyone else dared.
Journalists coined the term yellow journalism after a popular comic strip printed in yellow ink. It referred to sensationalism built on half-truths, emotional appeals, and bold exaggeration. Hearst wore the label like a badge of honor. Respectability mattered little. Winning was everything. Then came Cuba. By 1896, the island was fighting for independence from Spain. Hearst saw opportunity and seized it. Daily stories depicted Spanish atrocities, some true, many exaggerated, a few invented outright. He sent artists to sketch scenes of brutality, published letters supposedly penned by suffering Cubans begging for American intervention, and fanned outrage across the nation. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing 260 American sailors, Hearst's papers blamed Spain immediately before any official investigation. Headlines screamed accusations, illustrations showed Spanish saboteurs planting underwater mines, editorials demanded war. Modern historians still debate the Maine's fate. Officially a mine, modern analysis points to an accidental coal fire. In 1898, truth mattered less than narrative. The story Hearst told was loud enough to convince millions. America went to war. Circulation soared, and Hearst learned a lesson more powerful than any scoop. Control the story, and you control reality. Facts bend to whoever shouts loudest. He had found his power. Now he needed a palace worthy of a king. Chapter 4. Meeting Julia Morgan, the quiet genius. By 1900, Hearst's empire stretched across New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. His fortune was immense, his influence unquestioned, but he still had no true home. He owned apartments in New York, a mansion in San Francisco inherited from his mother in 1919, and properties scattered across the country. None of them satisfied the hunger ignited during his childhood European tour. They were fine homes, but they were not castles. He craved a place that made history tangible, a palace that could embody his wealth, taste, and ambition, a place where power could be seen, felt, and understood by anyone who entered. It was time to meet the architect who could transform that dream into stone. Julia Morgan, the quiet genius who would translate Hearst's audacious vision into reality. Together, they would embark on a decades-long journey to create America's most extravagant private palace and the theater for the life Hearst had always imagined. Then he remembered the ranch. His father had purchased 40,000 acres along the California coast near San Simeon in 1865. The land was breathtaking but remote. Rolling hills dotted with oak trees, high bluffs plunging into the Pacific, endless sky stretching in every direction. Young Willie had adored those trips, the freedom, the open space, the wind off the ocean, and the sense that this vast land somehow belonged to his family. After his mother's death, Hearst inherited the ranch. He was 56, unimaginably wealthy, and finally ready to create something permanent. He needed an architect.
Most men of his fortune would have turned to prestigious firms in New York or Boston, designers who catered to society families and built in established styles. Hearst chose differently. He hired Julia Morgan, a 47-year-old architect working quietly out of a San Francisco office. Morgan was extraordinary, a woman in a profession entirely dominated by men. She was the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, trained under the same masters who had designed Europe's grand monuments. Back in California, she had built a successful practice designing homes, churches, and institutional buildings, always precise, proportionate, and impeccably crafted. She was small, soft-spoken, methodical, and absolutely grounded. Where Hearst dreamed in grand gestures, she thought in load-bearing walls, drainage systems, and earthquake forces. He had employed her before on smaller projects, renovations, additions, a few buildings on his properties. He trusted her skill, but more importantly, he trusted her to listen. Morgan did not dictate what clients should want. She absorbed their vision and worked out how to make it real. In 1919, Hearst brought her to the hilltop at San Simeon. "I get tired of camping in tents up there," he said.
I'm getting a little old for that. I would like to build a little something. A little something. Morgan understood immediately that little in Hearst's vocabulary was not literal. She had worked with him long enough to know that his projects expanded, evolved, and grew once they were underway. She knew he collected art and antiquities by the shipload. She knew he wanted a palace to match his newspapers, his fortune, and his ego. What she could not yet know was that this little something would consume the next 28 years of her life. They began with sketches. Hearst wanted a main house on the hilltop, which he called La Casa Grande, and 3 guest cottages surrounding it. But the vision quickly expanded. The estate would eventually include pools, gardens, terraces, theaters, and a private zoo. Every addition was a negotiation between Morgan's precision and Hearst's appetite for grandeur. It was the start of a partnership that would produce one of the most extravagant private estates in American history, a castle born of obsession, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of dreams turned into stone. Hearst wanted Mediterranean styles, something reminiscent of the Spanish missions he remembered from his youth, but grander, richer, and more elaborate. He envisioned towers that punctured the sky, terraces cascading down hillsides, and pools that reflected both the sun and his ambition. Morgan listened intently. She walked the site, feeling the slopes beneath her feet, letting the ocean wind guide her understanding of the landscape. She took meticulous notes, sketching ideas, imagining how the stone, water, and sunlight might coexist. Then she returned to San Francisco and began drawing. Their relationship became one of the most remarkable partnerships in American architectural history. Hearst bombarded her with constant letters, filled with sketches, ideas, demands, and complaints. Morgan replied with precise drawings, careful cost estimates, and gentle corrections. When his ambitions defied physics, budgets, or common sense, she found a way to make the impossible real. When he changed his mind mid-project, she adapted without hesitation.
Construction began in 1919, though neither could have imagined the work would continue, evolving endlessly for decades. Chapter 5: A Playground for a Man Who Never Grew Up. The first structures rose quickly. Morgan began with the 3 guest cottages, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol, each large enough to rival most mansions. Positioned like sentinels on the hilltop, they waited patiently for La Casa Grande, the main house destined to dominate the ridge. Hearst, impatient for completion, already hosted guests in the half-finished site by 1920. Tents and newly completed cottages served as temporary lodging, while construction crews labored around them. He delighted in showing visitors the work in progress, pointing to bare foundations and announcing, "Here will be the tower." He guided them through unfinished rooms, describing the Renaissance furniture, carved fireplaces, and tapestries that would one day fill them. The castle grew in layers, constantly shifting as his tastes evolved. He toured Europe regularly, purchasing entire rooms from demolished palaces and monasteries, Spanish ceilings, Italian doorways, French fireplaces, Gothic choir stalls. He shipped them across the Atlantic in crates, instructing Morgan to build around them. If a ceiling did not fit, she redesigned the room. If a doorway required a wall to move, she moved it. Hearst treated the entire project like the world's most expensive toy. He constructed a palace with the imagination of a child building with blocks, adding pieces wherever they seemed interesting, unconcerned with symmetry or classical rules. Morgan transformed his impulsive vision into something cohesive, balancing chaos with architectural genius. La Casa Grande rose 4 stories, twin bell towers reaching skyward. The facade blended Spanish colonial elegance, Mediterranean proportions, and Gothic flourishes. Inside, rooms flowed unpredictably. A Gothic library opened onto a Spanish cloister. A Moorish sitting room led to a Renaissance bedroom. The assembly room, the house's heart, stretched 100 feet long, lined with choir stalls from an Italian monastery and hung with Flemish tapestries, more throne hall than living room. Then came the pools. The Neptune pool began as a simple rectangle. Too plain, insisted Hearst. Morgan added classical columns. Better, but still inadequate. Over 17 years, the pool underwent multiple complete reconstructions. Its final form stretched 104 feet, framed in Vermont marble, around turquoise water, crowned by a Roman temple facade and flanked by statues of Neptune and the Nereids. The indoor Roman pool drew inspiration from Italian baths, surfaces covered in hand-set mosaic tiles of blue, gold, and orange, 8 marble statues of gods and heroes lining the walls. Light filtered through alabaster globes, making the water glow from within, transforming it into a living jewel. Every stone, every tile, every statue was a testament to Hearst's vision and Morgan's mastery. A palace born of obsession, audacity, and the relentless pursuit of grandeur.
San Simeon looked like something Caesar might have built if Caesar had unlimited money and a California architect obsessed with detail. Towers pierced the sky, terraces cascaded down the hillside, and pools shimmered like jewels in the sun. But architecture was only half the spectacle. The zoo grew alongside the palace, a living testament to Hearst's appetite for excess. Animals arrived from across the globe: zebras, emus, kangaroos, elk, buffalo, even polar bears. They roamed semi-freely across carefully fenced hillsides, grazing among oak trees, creating a surreal blend of African wildlife and California ranchland. Guests drove up the winding road, past grazing zebras and exotic birds, and it all seemed entirely natural, as if the Pacific Coast had always belonged to royalty and beasts alike. Each year brought new additions: a tennis court, a second library, more guest rooms, another terrace, even a private airstrip. There was no end date, because Hearst had no intention of stopping. Building itself was the point. Collecting, acquiring, expanding. This was his proof that William Randolph Hearst could have anything he desired. Rules, budgets, and architectural coherence were mere suggestions in the face of his vision. By 1925, San Simeon had become legendary. Hollywood knew of it. Political circles whispered about it. Invitations to spend a weekend on the hilltop became the most coveted ticket in California. The parties were about to begin. Chapter 6. Marian Davies, the funny girl in the golden cage. The castle needed a queen, and Hearst found her in 1915, long before the first stone was laid at San Simeon. Marian Davies was an 18-year-old chorus girl on Broadway when they met. Hearst was 52, married with 5 sons, already one of the most powerful men in America. She was witty, warm, quick on her feet, and utterly charming, qualities that mattered more to him than conventional beauty or social rank. He fell hard. Within a year, he was financing her movie career, promoting her films through his newspapers, and using raw money and publicity to shape her into a star. She had real talent: sharp comic timing, a loose, natural screen presence, and ability to make even weak material come alive. But whispers followed her everywhere. Marian Davies was only famous because William Randolph Hearst said so. The whispers were not entirely wrong. Hearst poured millions into her career. He founded Cosmopolitan Pictures to produce her films, pressured theater owners to show them, and sometimes ordered critics to praise them against their judgment. When sound films arrived and silent stars vanished, Marian thrived because Hearst paid for the best directors, writers, and the most lavish sets. He tried to buy her permanence in Hollywood, but she never escaped the shadow of his influence. Millicent Hearst, the legal Mrs. Hearst, stayed in New York with their 5 sons, living separately but never agreeing to divorce.
Marian would never wear a wedding ring. She would never be introduced as Mrs. Hearst. She was always Miss Davies, the actress living with a married man. San Simeon became her refuge and her cage.
At the castle, Marian was the unofficial queen of hospitality. She greeted guests, guided conversations, remembered small preferences, and put Hollywood's biggest egos at ease at Hearst's stiff, rule-bound table. She was genuinely kind, steadying actors struggling with alcohol, helping chorus girls find roles, cutting tension with jokes, impressions, and a warmth that money could not buy. She also drank. At first socially, then steadily, and later heavily. The strain of constant gossip, playing the cheerful hostess nightly, being adored by Hearst but never fully accepted by society, these left their marks. The hilltop palace, dazzling to outsiders, sometimes felt like a beautiful prison with no exit. Yet she remained, through scandals, rumors, Hearst's failed political campaigns, public embarrassments and financial crises, anchoring the castle's glittering world with charm, resilience, and an endurance only the extraordinary could muster. She stayed because, from everything friends later said, she genuinely loved him. Not the empire, not the headlines, not the power games his newspapers played. She disliked how vicious they could be. She loved the private William Randolph Hearst, the man who could be goofy, generous, and surprisingly fragile when the world was not watching. He built her a 14-room bungalow on the MGM lot in Los Angeles, a smaller palace wired directly into the studio's power grid. He covered her in jewelry, rewrote scripts to highlight her strengths, and sought her opinion on everything from editorial campaigns to which antique tapestries should hang in which room at San Simeon. And every weekend he could, he flew or drove with her to the hilltop, where for a few days the world and its rules did not exist. Marian made San Simeon feel warm. She took Hearst's monument to his own ego and softened it into something closer to a home. The castle had its architect in Julia Morgan and its builder in William Randolph Hearst, but its heart, the reason guests returned, was Marian Davies. Without her, the parties were pure display. With her, they almost felt like gatherings of friends. Almost. Chapter 7. Hollywood on the Hill, the wildest party palace in America. The routine rarely changed. Friday afternoon, a private train car left Los Angeles carrying 15 to 30 invited guests. By early evening, it reached San Luis Obispo, where Hearst's limousines waited to collect them for the slow climb up the winding 5-mile road to the castle. The hour-long drive transformed the landscape before their eyes. Coastal scrub gave way to oak-studded hills, the air grew cooler, and glimpses of zebras or buffalo grazing in golden light reminded guests that they had entered another world, a world both impossible and entirely natural within Hearst's private universe. Then, with one final curve, the castle appeared on the ridge, white towers glowing against the darkening sky, floodlights washing over pools and terraces. It looked like something out of a dream or a movie set, which was precisely the point. Charlie Chaplin came regularly, so did Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Carole Lombard, Joan Crawford, and many others.
Over the years, nearly every major star of Hollywood's golden age spent a weekend at San Simeon, joined by directors, producers, writers, and occasional politicians or business tycoons. The guest list was invitation only and gloriously unpredictable. A silent film comedian might sit next to a Supreme Court justice. A Broadway actress might converse by the pool with a British lord. The castle operated on rules that were both relaxed and strict. Guests were assigned rooms, some in La Casa Grande, others in the cottages, all furnished with Renaissance furniture and museum-quality art. Formal dress was required for cocktails at 7:30 p.m. and dinner at 9, served at a long refectory table that could seat 40. Hearst claimed the center spot. Marian sat beside him, while the remaining guests were scattered with no obvious order of rank. The food was surprisingly plain. Amid opulence, Hearst preferred straightforward dishes, roast chicken, simple vegetables, and basic desserts. He disliked elaborate French cuisine and saw no reason to serve it just to impress. Ketchup and mustard bottles sat openly beside fine china and crystal, a reminder that despite unimaginable wealth, he still thought like a rancher's son. Dinner conversation was lively, but bounded by invisible rules. Guests told stories, gossiped, flirted, but no business deals were discussed, no political arguments started, and absolutely no one criticized Hearst or his newspapers within earshot. San Simeon was presented as neutral ground, a place to escape studio pressures and professional rivalries. The message was clear. As long as everyone remembered who owned the hill, the rest could wait. In this delicate balance of extravagance and control, of playfulness and hierarchy, San Simeon became more than a palace. It became a stage where Hollywood's brightest stars, the nation's power brokers, and a private man's personal dreams all collided, shimmered, and sometimes, for just a weekend, felt like magic. After dinner came the movie. Hearst's private theater, seating around 50, screened the newest Hollywood releases, often weeks before the public premiere. Studio heads sent him advance prints, a courtesy and a kind of insurance. A glowing mention in his newspapers could launch a career, a scathing one could bury it. Marian's films always played to warm applause, regardless of quality. No one wanted to be the guest who sat stone-faced while others laughed. As the credits rolled, the evening shifted into smaller, more intimate gatherings. Guests danced in sitting rooms, challenged each other at billiards or card tables, or wandered slowly through moonlit gardens while the Pacific wind stirred the trees. Everything stopped when Hearst's bedtime rule kicked in. Lights out at midnight. The public rooms went dark, the host withdrew, and the performance of the evening officially ended. Guests could remain awake in their rooms, but the show was over. Saturday had its own rhythm. Guests swam in the Neptune or Roman pools, played tennis on sunlit courts, rode horses across the rolling hills, or lounged on terraces while servants delivered drinks and light meals.
Some wandered the endless rooms, marveling at the art collection, tapestries, statues, and ceilings painstakingly imported from Europe and reconstructed on the hilltop. Others napped or quietly worked on scripts and correspondence. The atmosphere felt easygoing, yet an unspoken bargain underpinned it all. You were here because Hearst allowed it. You enjoyed luxury beyond nearly any hotel on earth. In return, you did not cross him, not in print, in public, or before his staff. Most guests adored the arrangement. It was a chance to network with Hollywood's elite in a setting that felt almost unreal, to see art normally hidden behind velvet ropes, and to swim in pools that many called the most beautiful in America, with zebras grazing nearby like extras in some bizarre studio production. Yet a few visitors found it unsettling. They noticed how closely Hearst observed every interaction. They felt the weight of his newspapers, which could elevate or ruin careers with a single headline. Beneath the generous hospitality lay invisible strings, felt but never explicitly seen. The castle was many things at once: a playground, a museum, a private studio lot, a stage set for its owner. What it was not, and never tried to be, was a normal home. It was a demonstration of power cloaked as a weekend escape, and that demonstration was about to grow darker. Between election cycles, Hearst poured money into candidates who promised to back his ideas, only to turn his newspapers on them with brutal ferocity when they disappointed him. Presidents courted his endorsement, senators feared his attacks, local politicians across the country checked Hearst's editorials before committing to controversial positions. You did not need his support to survive, but having it certainly helped, and you definitely did not want his papers turned against you. San Simeon became more than a party palace, it became a political stage. Senators slipped up to the hilltop for quiet weekends, discussing upcoming bills far from cameras. Governors appeared when Hearst wanted to talk about state contracts, utility rates, or tax policies. Presidential hopefuls made pilgrimages to the castle, fully aware that favorable front-page coverage in Hearst's papers could nudge an election. The castle offered politicians something almost as valuable as publicity: privacy. Away from rival journalists and party operatives, deals could be floated, tested, and refined without leaving a paper trail. Hearst could spell out what he wanted. Politicians could feel out how far they could go without provoking hostile headlines. Everyone smiled for photos by the Neptune pool, knowing the real negotiations were happening on shaded terraces or in quiet sitting rooms after dinner. The line between journalism and political manipulation did not just blur, it vanished entirely. When Hearst opposed a policy, his papers framed it as an impending catastrophe. When he supported a candidate, that person received glowing profiles, while opponents were dragged through stories of petty scandals, old rumors, or carefully curated attacks on character. Facts became tools, flexible and malleable, arranged to serve Hearst's chosen narrative. Editors understood their role was not to provide neutral truth, but to help William Randolph Hearst win. Hollywood guests watched all of this with mixed emotions. Some admired the sheer power, the idea that one man could shake presidents by rattling a printing press. Others found it unsettling. Crossing Hearst carried consequences. An actor who annoyed him might see vicious gossip about their personal life splashed across entertainment pages. A director who criticized his politics could find films mysteriously savaged by reviewers. A producer who refused to book Marian's pictures might suddenly struggle to get positive coverage for other projects. The castle's hospitality came with invisible chains. Most guests never noticed these chains because they never tested them. They swam in the pools, complimented Marian's films, avoided political discussion at the table, and left with good memories and valuable connections. But Marian saw the darker reality. She watched senators and governors flatter Hearst to his face, only to roll their eyes when he left the room. She observed studio executives laughing at his jokes in the assembly room, then complaining bitterly about his interference once back in Los Angeles. She understood that many guests did not come out of love for Hearst, they came out of fear or necessity. And she watched Hearst himself grow increasingly isolated. He had power, he had wealth, he had the most spectacular residence in America, yet he had very few people around him who loved him for anything other than what he could provide. The castle was a throne, and thrones are lonely places, even when full of guests. Especially when full of guests.
Chapter 9. The People Below the Stairs. While movie stars sipped cocktails by the Neptune pool, another population kept San Simeon alive. The staff, the workers, the countless people whose names never appeared in gossip columns, yet whose labor made every glittering weekend possible. At its peak, San Simeon employed more than 150 full-time staff, from butlers and chefs to gardeners, housekeepers, chauffeurs, and maintenance crews. Every detail, from polished silverware to humming air conditioners, required human hands. These were the people who swept floors as chandeliers gleamed above, tended the gardens where zebras grazed, and delivered trays of cocktails to guests lounging on sunlit terraces. They worked quietly, invisibly, yet without them the palace would have been just another unfinished fantasy.
Their efforts ensured that the fantasy of San Simeon, its effortless luxury, its political theater, its dazzling art and architecture, felt real. It was a world of contrast, the glittering upper floors filled with Hollywood stars, politicians, and billionaires, and the hidden floors below, where ordinary human labor turned impossible dreams into reality. San Simeon was a palace built for display, but it lived and breathed because of those who never sought the spotlight. Maids, cooks, gardeners, electricians, plumbers, drivers, animal keepers for the zoo, guards patrolling the grounds, switchboard operators and secretaries, a workforce large enough to run a sprawling hotel, a working ranch, and a private resort simultaneously. They labored in shifts around the clock to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury, making San Simeon appear as if it ran by magic. Staff lived in dormitories and small houses scattered across the property, far from the main house so guests might never notice them. They worked long hours for wages that were decent by 1920s standards, but meager compared to the staggering fortune of William Randolph Hearst. They adhered to strict rules governing how, when, and if they could interact with guests, or even the Hearsts themselves. Staff were expected to be invisible. A maid cleaning a guest room was to vanish if footsteps approached in the hallway. Gardeners working near terraces stepped back when Hearst or his visitors appeared. Drivers waited patiently in sweltering cars for hours. Cooks prepared elaborate meals for dozens, yet never dined in the dining room. The castle's magic was complete. Rooms spotless, gardens immaculate, food appearing on time, yet no laborer ever seen. The class divide was absolute. Hearst treated his staff with distant politeness, but never with true equality. He knew the head gardener's name, but not the dozen men who labored under him. He recognized excellent service, but seldom asked about the lives of those providing it. To him, they were essential components of the operation, as critical and interchangeable as plumbing or electrical systems. Some staff stayed for decades. The work was steady, the setting breathtaking, and compared to other employers, California offered few better options. Others left quickly, exhausted by isolation and hierarchy. San Simeon sat nearly 50 miles from the nearest sizable town, leaving staff with limited time off and few opportunities to escape the property. For those from farms or small communities, the ranch could feel less like opportunity and more like self-imposed confinement.
Cooks labored in industrial kitchens below the grand dining room, preparing meals for 40 or more guests at a time, using recipes personally approved by Hearst. They served simple roast chicken, vegetables, and desserts on priceless china, feeding people who could afford anything in the world. The irony was never lost. Maids scrubbed floors beneath ceilings imported from European palaces, cleaned rooms filled with Renaissance paintings and medieval tapestries, earning in a month what a single antique chair cost. Yet their own dormitories were stark, shared, and minimally furnished. Gardeners maintained 83 acres of ornamental plantings, including exotic species shipped from around the globe. They pruned, watered, fertilized, and replanted endlessly so guests could stroll past without noticing. When Hearst decided a full-grown oak tree should be moved 50 feet to improve a view, they did the impossible. Animal keepers cared for the castle's menagerie: zebras, elk, bears, monkeys, and more. The animals were costly, temperamental, and sometimes dangerous. Keepers endured every kind of weather, nursing injuries, illnesses, and responding to escapes, all while Hearst proudly showcased the menagerie to delighted visitors who saw only novelty and spectacle. These workers built the castle alongside Julia Morgan's construction crews, kept it running during its glory years, and witnessed from the edges as the fortune that paid them slowly began to crack. Hearst spent millions on art and European treasures, while occasionally delaying staff paychecks when cash flow tightened. Requests for basic repairs in staff housing were deferred, even as entire rooms from European estates were unpacked and installed in the castle.
They were the invisible foundation beneath San Simeon's dazzling veneer, the human machinery that turned a billionaire's obsession into reality. Without them, the magic, the grandeur, the stagecraft of the Hilltop Palace would have collapsed into chaos. Yet they remained largely unseen, quietly ensuring that the dream and the illusion persisted. The people who kept his paradise functioning were the first to feel the strain when his empire faltered. They were loyal, they were skilled, they were essential, and yet they remained almost entirely invisible to the man whose dream they sustained with their hands and their time. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Marble: Debt, Doubt, and Isolation. The first cracks appeared in 1929, but Hearst refused to see them. The stock market crashed in October. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated almost overnight. The Great Depression settled over America like a long, relentless winter. Advertisers slashed budgets, newspapers lost revenue, and circulation dropped as workers without jobs could no longer buy daily papers. Streams of income that had flowed steadily for decades slowed to a thin, unreliable trickle. Yet Hearst kept spending. He bought more art, he added more rooms to San Simeon, he financed more of Marian's films. He kept his sprawling newspaper empire operating at full strength. Even as competitors folded, merged, or retrenched to survive, he behaved as if money were an endless river, as if his empire were too vast to sink, as if economic disaster was something that happened to other people, ordinary people, not to William Randolph Hearst. His accountants warned him, his sons pleaded for cuts, business managers brought detailed reports showing the widening gap between income and expenses. Hearst ignored them all. He had built his empire by thinking big and spending boldly. Cutting back was not prudent, it felt like surrender. The bills mounted relentlessly. Payments to art dealers for purchases made years earlier. Construction at San Simeon consuming millions each year. Payroll for thousands of employees across his newspaper chain arriving like clockwork. Property taxes due on estates scattered nationwide. Marian's film productions, many unprofitable, needing constant cash injections, and the zoo on the hilltop required ceaseless, costly maintenance. By 1935, Hearst owed roughly $125 million, the modern equivalent of around $2 billion. His assets were enormous but largely illiquid. Newspapers, real estate, art collections worth hundreds of millions, but impossible to convert fast enough to cover his obligations. Eventually, the banks intervened. In 1937, a consortium of creditors took control of Hearst's finances, installing their own managers to oversee his empire and placing strict limits on his spending. Assets were sold, newspapers shuttered or sold off, real estate holdings liquidated, and most painfully, they began selling his art, the treasures he had spent 4 decades collecting. Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, medieval tapestries, objects that had filled San Simeon and his other estates were now tagged with prices and auctioned to the highest bidder. Gimbel's department store in New York held a public sale of Hearst's collection. Thousands of items, once symbols of his power, lined multiple floors as wealthy buyers selected pieces Hearst had painstakingly acquired from European palaces. Newspapers, including former rivals, reported the sale as a spectacle of humiliation. The man who had spent decades proving he could never lose anything was now parting with it, piece by piece, to satisfy creditors. Construction at San Simeon stopped entirely. Workers were dismissed. Plans for new wings and terraces were abandoned mid-project. Scaffolding surrounded unfinished walls. The castle that had grown continuously for nearly 2 decades suddenly froze. Half-completed sections were left exposed to sun, wind, and rain. Under the weight of all this, Hearst seemed to age overnight. He was 74, his health declining, his vitality drained. The man who once bent public opinion with a single headline now had to ask permission to spend his own money. Marian watched helplessly as the restless energy that had driven him for decades dwindled. The vibrant, commanding figure who had transformed a hilltop into America's most extravagant palace was now a shadow of himself, trapped in the marble fortress of his own making.
He became short-tempered, withdrawn, fixated on the smallest details of the castle's decor because he could no longer control the larger forces tearing his empire apart. Every piece of Renaissance furniture, every imported tapestry, every marble column suddenly seemed both trivial and essential, a reminder of what he had lost control over. Marian tried to shield him from the harshest realities, to soften the blows with jokes, conversation, and small gestures of care. She tried to keep San Simeon alive, to maintain the illusion that the castle remained the playground of dreams. But the truth could not be hidden. The dream was collapsing. The parties at San Simeon grew less frequent, then rare, and eventually stopped altogether. Invitations to the hilltop, once the most coveted tickets in California, no longer carried the same magic. The castle fell silent. Staff levels dwindled to a skeleton crew, tasked with the bare minimum of upkeep. Whole sections of La Casa Grande were shuttered to save on heating, maintenance, and staffing. Rooms that had once echoed with laughter, music, and the clinking of crystal now stood dark and locked, their tapestries, ceilings, and priceless furniture reduced to assets on a banker's spreadsheet. By 1947, doctors decreed that Hearst could no longer reside at San Simeon. The hilltop was too remote, the winding road too treacherous, and emergency care too far away should anything happen. He needed to be closer to Los Angeles, closer to hospitals, specialists, and the world he had once dominated. In May of that year, William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the last time. He moved into a rented house in Beverly Hills, smaller, plainer, a shadow of the palatial kingdom he had built, watching from the sidelines as his empire endured without him, closer now to the inevitable end. Whether he accepted it or not, the castle remained on its hill, empty, quiet, a monument in marble and concrete to dreams that grew too large, appetites that refused to stop, and a man who discovered that even the mightiest empire has a breaking point. Chapter 11. Leaving the Hill. The Beverly Hills house felt like a prison compared to the grandeur of San Simeon. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, no towers, no terraces, no turquoise pools glinting in the Pacific sunlight, just a modest mansion on a quiet street where an old man could fade away without fanfare. Hearst spent his final years shuffling through those modest rooms, reading newspapers he no longer controlled, watching a world he had shaped move on without him. The banks had stabilized his finances, selling enough assets to satisfy creditors, but the cost was everything that had once defined William Randolph Hearst. His newspaper chain was smaller, his political influence diminished, his treasured art collection dispersed. And San Simeon, the crown jewel of his life's work, the physical manifestation of his wealth, power, and obsession, sat empty on a distant hilltop, a paradise he would never see again. Marian stayed with him. She did not have to. By then, she was wealthy in her own right, with money saved from her career and investments independent of Hearst. She could have returned to Hollywood, rebuilt a social life, and escaped the slow, suffocating routine of watching a once dominant man shrink before her eyes. Yet she stayed. She remained through declining health, bitter moods, and growing dependence on nurses, doctors, and medication. She stayed because after 36 years together, leaving felt less like freedom and more like tearing out a piece of her own life. Hearst died on August 14, 1951, at the age of 88. Marian was at his bedside. Millicent Hearst, still legally his wife despite decades of separation, flew in from New York for the funeral, as did his 5 sons. Hollywood sent flowers and polished statements of respect. Newspapers he had founded ran long obituaries attempting to measure his legacy. Marian, however, was not invited to the ceremony.
The family made it clear. She had been his companion, his partner in life and in the creation of San Simeon for over 3 decades, but never his wife. In the official record, she did not exist. 36 years of shared history vanished with one unspoken decision. She accepted it without complaint, knowing she had never truly expected anything else. The castle had been her home, yet it had never belonged to her. The life she built alongside Hearst existed in a legal gray zone, dissolving the moment his heart stopped. After his death, the Hearst family controlled everything: businesses, estates, and San Simeon itself. And they faced an immediate, brutal reality. The empire Hearst had built, for all its grandeur and excess, now required careful management or it risked collapse. The castle was enormously expensive to maintain. Utilities for hundreds of rooms, staff to keep the sprawling estate from crumbling, constant repairs to buildings already worn by decades of harsh coastal weather, and property taxes that felt like a punishment. It all added up to a staggering financial burden. The Hearst family had no practical use for a 240-room Mediterranean-style palace perched on a remote California hilltop, a place designed for a man who wanted everything and everyone at his whim. They weighed their options carefully, as one does with something simultaneously iconic and impractical. Sell it privately to some billionaire with the resources and whim to maintain it, demolish it entirely and write off the folly as a painful chapter of family history, or simply lock it up and allow it to quietly decay into the fog and wind that swept across the hilltop. None of these choices felt right. The castle was too famous to destroy, too fantastical and peculiar to sell easily, and too historically significant, even in their eyes, to leave it to nature's slow reclamation. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation arrived at a decision that balanced practicality with legacy. They donated San Simeon to the state of California. The family retained ownership of the surrounding ranch land, but gave the castle, the guest cottages, the pools, and 123 acres of hilltop to the public. The condition was simple. It had to become a state historical monument, preserved carefully and opened for guided tours. In this way, a solution emerged from an impossible problem. The state would cover ongoing maintenance through admissions fees, ensuring the castle would not fall into ruin. The Hearst name would remain attached to something grand and intact rather than to a crumbling relic. And the public, for the first time in nearly 40 years, would gain entry into the legendary palace that had once been visible from the highway, yet off-limits to all but the privileged few.
California accepted the gift, and plans to convert the private palace into a public museum began immediately. Staff were hired, tour routes meticulously mapped, safety regulations implemented, and signs and ropes placed where servants had once walked unseen. The castle that William Randolph Hearst had built to keep the world at a controlled distance would now open its doors to anyone willing to buy a ticket and follow a guide. It was a strange transformation from fortress of private power to open cultural treasure, from a world closed to outsiders to one curated for the public eye. Marian Davies watched all of this unfold from afar. She never returned to San Simeon after Hearst died. The castle held too many memories for her, memories of love, laughter, loyalty, and sorrow, and none of them belonged to her in any official sense. For decades, she had been the castle's beating heart, the hostess who gave life to marble halls and grand parties, but the historical record would barely remember her. She died in 1961, 10 years after Hearst, wealthy, comfortable, and largely forgotten by the Hollywood that had once clamored for her attention. And yet the castle outlived them both, standing as a testament to a dream far bigger than either of their lifetimes. Chapter 12. What Remains of a Dream. The first public tours began in June 1958. Visitors climbed the same winding road that once carried Hollywood royalty, senators and movie moguls, now arriving in buses instead of limousines. They paid a modest admission fee, $2, roughly $20 today, and followed guides through rooms that still carried the faint scent of old money and faded ambition.
The guides told a polished, sanitized version of the castle's story. Hearst was introduced as a newspaper publisher, art collector, and cultural figure. Renaissance ceilings, medieval tapestries, and imported sculptures were highlighted, while the more complicated truths, his paper closures, massive debts, and political manipulations, were left unspoken. The Neptune pool, the assembly room, the Roman and outdoor terraces were presented as aesthetic marvels, stripped of the history of power, influence, and carefully engineered social hierarchies that had once pulsed through them. Marian Davies was scarcely mentioned, appearing, if at all, as a passing footnote, an actress who occasionally visited, rather than the woman who had held the castle's heart for 3 decades, who had quietly supported struggling actors, and who had been a loyal companion to a man incapable of offering her legal recognition. History was being rewritten in real time, sanding down the messy edges to produce a story digestible to tourists and easy for guides to narrate. Early visitors left with mixed impressions. Many were awestruck by the sheer luxury, the scale, and the audacity of the construction. Others found it gaudy, overblown, even ridiculous. The clash of architectural styles, Mediterranean revival, Gothic fragments, Renaissance furniture, and imported ceilings confounded neat labels. It was neither a palace in any traditional European sense, nor quite a museum, though it contained objects that could rival one. It was a monument to ambition, to wealth, and to the people, known and unknown, whose labor and vision had made it endure.
It felt like a strange hybrid, a rich man's fantasy made solid, now open to the public, almost like a theme park attraction. Former staff members sometimes joined the tours, blending into the crowd as paying visitors. They walked past spaces they had once scrubbed, polished, or repaired. Their eyes caught details most would never notice: a faint stain on marble they had once tried to remove, a terrace where they had worked through brutal heat, a doorway where Hearst had barked orders with relentless energy. They rarely spoke up. Their memories were invisible to the official narrative, which focused on the builder and his famous guests, not the army of workers who had kept the sprawling estate running. The state set about stabilizing the property. Years of disuse and terraces crumbled under weather and time. Restoration began slowly, funded by admission fees that rose as word spread about the castle's hypnotic grandeur. Journalists rediscovered San Simeon. Magazine features labeled it Hearst's Folly, his monument to excess, his real-life Xanadu. The comparison to Citizen Kane was inevitable. Orson Welles had loosely based his 1941 masterpiece on Hearst's life, portraying a lonely tycoon surrounded by treasures yet starved of genuine companionship. The film's Xanadu, vast and empty, eerily mirrored San Simeon. Hearst had despised Citizen Kane. He had used his newspapers to attack the film, pressured theaters not to show it, and tried to bury it entirely. That campaign failed. The movie endured, becoming a classic, and now tourists walked through the real Hearst Castle, quietly comparing reality with Wells's darker fictional portrait, wondering how much had been true. Over time, the castle's meaning shifted. It stopped being celebrated purely as a symbol of success and began to serve as a cautionary tale. Look what happens when wealth and ego are given no limits. Look at what remains when the guests leave, the parties end, and the music dies. Look at this extraordinary, lonely place, built to impress people who never truly cared about the man behind it. And still people kept coming. Thousands per year at first, then tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands. The private world Hearst had constructed to exclude the masses became one of California's most visited landmarks. School groups marched through its halls, families checked it off on road trips, architecture students took careful notes, and international travelers marveled at the hilltop where Hollywood royalty had once laughed, danced, and drank. The dream Hearst built to assert his own importance now belonged to everyone, a twist of fate he would have loathed more than any bad headline.
Chapter 13. The Dark Side in the Marble. The tours did not tell the whole story. They could not. The truth was far too complicated, too uncomfortable, and too distant from the polished narrative California wanted attached to one of its most famous estates. Behind every stone at San Simeon stood the empire that had paid for it, a media empire built on practices far darker than art collecting and architectural ambition. Hearst's newspapers reshaped America, often for the worse. They pioneered a style of journalism where emotion trumped accuracy, sensation outpaced truth, and profit eclipsed public good. When circulation needed a boost, headlines stretched or invented scandals. When Hearst wanted war, his front pages manufactured outrage. When he opposed a political candidate, his papers destroyed reputations with half-truths and carefully engineered lies. The Spanish-American War was only the most famous example. Decades later, Hearst's publications continued to stoke fear and prejudice, particularly against Chinese and Japanese communities on the West Coast. Editorials and cartoons reinforced racist stereotypes, justified discriminatory laws, and encouraged social hostility. San Simeon, glittering and magical from the outside, was thus shadowed by the reality of its creator, a man whose vision of grandeur rested as much on spectacle and power as it did on art, architecture, and wealth.
They turned complex political debates into morality plays, where Hearst's chosen side was always heroic and his opponents were inevitably corrupt. This was no accidental byproduct of his empire, it was the engine that fueled it. Every marble tower, every shimmering pool, every imported Renaissance ceiling was financed by newspapers that stoked fear, anger, and division. San Simeon dazzled the eye, but beneath the gilded surface, the foundation was fragile. Hearst seemed oblivious, or indifferent. He believed his papers revealed truths the respectable media ignored, casting himself as the champion of ordinary Americans against a corrupt elite, all while residing in a palace that made the grandest European nobility appear modest. The contradiction never troubled him. San Simeon also tells a broader American story, the tale of the Gilded Age and its aftermath. Hearst inherited his fortune from his father's mining operations, then multiplied it through a media empire largely unchecked in its power to mislead, manipulate, and dominate public opinion. He built the castle in an era with minimal labor protections, no environmental regulations, and a widening chasm between wealth and work. Hundreds of laborers slept in plain dormitories, while Hearst rested beneath ceilings plucked from Renaissance palaces. Exotic animals for the zoo arrived from the wild with little thought for conservation. Priceless artworks were uprooted from European families desperate to sell in the wake of war and debt. Centuries of heritage became the ornaments of a single man's fantasy. Modern visitors often marvel at the beauty, yet miss the invisible machinery behind it, the workers who built it and maintained it, the displaced wildlife, the families forced to sell their history, the newspaper readers manipulated into supporting wars and policies they scarcely understood. Hearst's media model did not vanish, it evolved through radio, television, cable news, and now algorithm-driven social media, always capturing attention, monetizing it, and using it to shape reality. San Simeon stands as proof. Unchecked power can produce astonishing beauty, but also leave moral and human decay in its shadow. Every step past the Neptune pool is a reminder, a life spent accumulating rather than understanding, taking instead of giving. The marble shines, but the stains run deep.
Chapter 14. Julia Morgan and Marian Davies, the other builders. San Simeon's story was never just Hearst's. Two extraordinary women shaped it as indelibly as its wealthy owner, yet history has often minimized or erased them. Julia Morgan spent 28 years on the project, making more than 800 trips from San Francisco over rough, winding roads.
She transformed Hearst's chaos into enduring structures, solving engineering nightmares and blending architectural styles into a cohesive, improbable beauty. Without her skill, San Simeon would have been little more than a collection of impossible dreams. Marian Davies, meanwhile, was the castle's heart. She welcomed guests, softened Hearst's extremes, and transformed the sprawling, ostentatious estate into a space that felt lived in, human, and warm. Without her, the parties would have been sterile displays. With her, they shimmered with charm, laughter, and fleeting intimacy amid the marble and towers. Together, Morgan and Davies completed the triangle of vision, labor, and life. Hearst built the frame, Morgan gave it structure, and Marian infused it with humanity. San Simeon, magnificent and flawed, owes as much to these women as it does to the man whose fortune financed it. Yet their stories have often been footnotes, overshadowed by the headlines and the echo of Hearst's booming ambition.
Hearst demanded the impossible. Julia Morgan sat down with pencil, tracing paper, and an unwavering sense of purpose and turned the impossible into something tangible, solid, and lasting. She did this while navigating battles Hearst never even had to consider. As a woman in a profession dominated entirely by men, she faced skepticism and outright dismissal at every turn, from contractors who doubted her authority, to suppliers who assumed she was unqualified, to city inspectors who questioned her every calculation. Time and again she proved them wrong, yet the proving never truly ended. Every new project, every alteration required her to demonstrate the brilliance and competence that male architects were simply granted by default. The expectations she bore were invisible but relentless, an unending weight of scrutiny layered on top of the immense physical and mental demands of designing a castle as unique and chaotic as San Simeon. Morgan was paid well by the standards of the era, yet never nearly enough to reflect the magnitude of Hearst's dependence on her. He valued her brilliance, yet he took full advantage of her patience, endurance, and professionalism. Plans shifted constantly, forcing her to redraw elevations, recalculate structural loads, and anticipate whims that could change overnight. Payments were delayed when Hearst's cash flow tightened, and weekends and holidays became extensions of her work week, filled with urgent telegrams, late-night letters, and painstaking revisions. She accepted these conditions because San Simeon was a once-in-a-lifetime project, a sprawling, unprecedented commission that few architects could even imagine, let alone execute. And yet, when Hearst's finances collapsed and construction stopped, Morgan was quietly dismissed. No ceremony marked nearly 3 decades of brilliance. She returned to her San Francisco office, resumed smaller projects, and eventually retired, leaving behind a testament in stone, tile, and marble that silently spoke for her genius. When California opened San Simeon to the public, her name barely appeared. Guides told visitors that Hearst built the castle, leaving unspoken that it was Morgan who designed it, solved its engineering challenges, and made the constantly shifting ideas of an impulsive media tycoon structurally possible. The architectural achievement was attributed to the client rather than the architect. Morgan never complained publicly. She had always preferred that her work speak for itself, but the injustice remained. The castle admired by millions was as much hers as Hearst's. History, however, chose to remember only one name. Marian Davies faced a different erasure. After Hearst's death, the decades-long affair she shared with him was scrubbed from official narratives. Tour guides omitted her. Photographs where she appeared prominently were tucked away or removed, and the warmth, humor, and human presence she brought to San Simeon vanished from the story. Yet Marian's impact extended far beyond being Hearst's mistress.
Using a fortune built partly from his support and partly from her own savvy investments, she funded children's hospitals, supported polio clinics, and quietly aided struggling actors, crew members, and friends from her Hollywood years. While Hearst spent decades projecting power, control, and spectacle, Marian spent hers effecting real, lasting change. Hollywood once joked that she succeeded only because of Hearst. The truth was far more nuanced. Yes, he financed her films and promoted them through his newspapers, but she possessed genuine talent, effortless screen presence, sharp comic timing, and a reputation for kindness and generosity off camera. Her career may have been enabled by Hearst, but her character, skill, and judgment belonged solely to her. Together, Julia Morgan and Marian Davies gave decades of their lives to Hearst's dream. One made the castle stand, the other made it feel alive. Both were brilliant and indispensable, yet historically diminished, reduced to footnotes in a story that centered on a man incapable of achieving the vision alone. Today, history is slowly correcting itself. Modern tours now highlight Morgan's extraordinary role, acknowledging her engineering genius and architectural artistry. Biographies and documentaries present Marian more sympathetically, honoring her loyalty, humanity, and philanthropy rather than focusing solely on scandal. Scholars now recognize that San Simeon is as much a monument to these two extraordinary women as it is to William Randolph Hearst himself, a collaborative masterpiece forged from vision, intellect, courage, and enduring dedication.
For decades, the story of the castle was told as if William Randolph Hearst had single-handedly willed it into existence, armed only with wealth, ambition, and relentless determination. That was never the full story. He could not and never did do it alone. The castle stands as it does today because two extraordinary women shaped its reality. Julia Morgan made it possible, turning chaos into structure, fantasy into engineering, and whims into walls that would endure storms and time. Marian Davies gave it life, warmth, and humanity, turning a palace of stone and marble into a home where laughter, conversation, and music could breathe. Without them, Hearst's dream would have remained a distant vision on the California hills, a monument on paper rather than a living place. Chapter 15. The Hill, the Sea, and the Stories We Leave Behind. The sun rises over San Simeon much as it did a century ago, spilling golden light across the hillside. It touches the white towers first, then glides down over terraces, pools, and gardens. The Pacific stretches endlessly beyond, shimmering and indifferent, as though the ocean itself regards the palace with quiet neutrality. Visitors arrive early, gathering in the visitors' center before buses snake up the winding oak-lined road. They come from everywhere. Families on vacation, architecture students with sketchbooks, history enthusiasts tracing the footsteps of tycoons and stars, and curious travelers drawn by the legend of Hearst Castle. They pass through the same rooms where Charlie Chaplin once laughed, where senators whispered deals over coffee, where power, wealth, and ambition once collided. Occasionally, a few linger at the Neptune pool, dipping their feet where Hollywood royalty once posed and splashed, bridging past and present for a fleeting moment.
Most leave awed by the scale, some unsettled by the extravagance, and a few reflect deeply on the man who built it and the lessons embedded in its story. William Randolph Hearst wanted to be remembered, and in that narrow sense, he succeeded. The castle still stands. His name remains on the signs. Hundreds of thousands say it aloud every year. Yet what they remember is rarely what he intended. They recall the excess, the empty halls built for crowds that never arrived, the warning whispered through marble and stone. Dreams can grow too large, appetites can never be fully sated, and ambition untethered from purpose can be lonely and destructive. Many visitors think first of Citizen Kane before Hearst himself. The castle now teaches uncomfortable truths about the American dream. What happens when success is measured only in accumulation, when influence is wielded over people rather than earned, and when power, possessions, and publicity are mistaken for legacy. Hearst collected art, land, headlines, political sway, and celebrity friends. He died wealthy, yet diminished, separated from the hilltop that had defined him. His empire fractured, his image dissolving into myth and rumor. His achievements survived, but the story they tell is not the one he imagined. Yet there is hope in what San Simeon has become. The palace that once excluded ordinary people now welcomes them. The estate that showcased one man's superiority now treats all visitors equally, first come, first served. School children wander through rooms once reserved for millionaires. Tourists from modest backgrounds marvel under ceilings imported from European palaces. People once mocked in Hearst's newspapers stroll freely through his private world. A monument to inequality has over time transformed into a symbol of public access, of shared wonder, of history reclaimed. Perhaps that is the true legacy, not the building itself, but what it became after the builder lost control. Not the parties, but the quiet that followed. Not Hearst's original dream, but the stories we choose to tell once the music stops. Most of us will never build castles, run empires, or host stars. Yet we can learn from what remains and decide what to do with the ruins left behind, shaping meaning from excess, life from ambition, and humanity from marble.
But each of us, in our own way, constructs smaller worlds through the choices we make, the labor we pour into our passions, the relationships we nurture, and the ways we wield whatever influence or power comes our way. Every life leaves behind stories, some monumental, some invisible, but all mark the passage of our existence. San Simeon quietly poses a question that resonates beyond the walls of any mansion or monument. What kind of story do you wish to leave? One defined by accumulation, by the relentless pursuit of power over others, or one of contribution, marked by service, humility, and connection? Do you seek to place yourself at the center of every scene, or do you honor the countless hands and hearts that helped you build your vision? Hearst chose accumulation. He chose power. He chose himself. And in the end, he departed life in a rented house, far removed from the castle meant to immortalize his greatness. Yet the castle endures, majestic, unnecessary, breathtaking, its honesty speaking in ways its architect never imagined. The ocean stretches beyond it, infinite and patient, outlasting headlines, empires, and egos alike. Perhaps the story we leave behind matters less than we think, but the way we treat others while writing that story, that matters profoundly. San Simeon stands as a testament to both truths, silently, eternally.